Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Ryan Holston, the professor and holder of the Jonathan Myrick Daniels 61 Chair of Academic Excellence at Virginia Military Institute. And we're here today to talk about his book, Tradition and the Deliberative Turn. Dr. Holston, wonderful to have you on today.
Thanks so much for having me, PJ. This is great.
So tell me, why this book? What led you to it, and why do you think, why should people read it?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Great one to start out with. I guess, the book is, in a sense, about two big topics, and I probably am interested more in one than the other. Deliberative democracy is this kind of big movement in political philosophy or political theory over the last 3+ decades. And those two themes, deliberation and democracy, kind of come together in this literature. And I guess you could say that I'm more interested in the deliberation part of things, but I think that contemporary democratic theory has kind of taken a wrong turn, if you will. And so, anyway, that's sort of, I guess, on a scholarly level, where my interests lie. But, on a more just sort of contemporary level, I think deliberation at least in this country, is kind of in a bad place right now. I think that we don't really, and this kind of connects with some things we were saying before we went on the air, but we don't really hear one another. We do a lot of talking, but things like ideology, things like emotion, there's all sorts of things that kind of get in the way of that listening that is so important. And so I just thought that studying this with a philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer, who I thought was looking at things a little bit differently than a lot of people in the contemporary scholarly literature were doing, that he would be a good person to turn to for some insight. So that's just kind of the big picture overview, I guess, of what got me interested in the subject.
Is that where the tradition comes in from your use of Gadamer?
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I get this question quite a bit about, in what sense do you mean tradition? And
it's on my list. Yeah.
It has a lot of uses and a lot of meanings for a lot of people. So that's probably a great thing to get out of the way right up front. I look at that word as kind of a more concise way to articulate, yes, something that I get from Gadamer. But you'll notice what I use in the book in the kind of long form, the long form sort of way of saying that is small scale communities that exist over time. And I guess you could say that I'm trying to get at two things there. One is the scale on which I'm talking about tradition. So I'm not talking about anything like the American tradition, right? And I'm not talking about a literary tradition or anything like that. I'm talking about something that looks more like a community of people living together with shared practices, if that makes sense. And then the other thing that I'm trying to get at is the overtime part, because if I guess maybe have any sort of familiarity with contemporary political theory, there's a lot of talk, especially this emerges in the 1990s, a lot of talk about sort of communitarianism. Sometimes it's referred to as neo-Aristotelianism. And what I think Gadamer gets at, maybe a little bit better than some of those guys, which I have a ton of affinity for, and think that they're up to some really good things. But what I think Gadamer maybe gets a little bit better or more right than they do is the historical nature of community. So the fact that communities don't just emerge out of nowhere, right? But they have a history and it's usually more than one generation that it takes to develop a community. So anyway, so that that's kind of my long answer to what do I mean by tradition, I guess, in this context. I'm not saying that all tradition is always helpful for deliberation, but I do think that deliberation needs that meaning of tradition, the small scale communities and those that exist over time, in order to be, I guess you might say, sound or genuine or legitimate. And I try and sort of qualify deliberation and the successful deliberation in those ways in the book. I think we can talk and we can be technically deliberating. But again, I don't think we always hear one another. And so that's what I mean by successful deliberation or genuine or authentic deliberation. When people really hear one another, are listening to one another, and on the same page, you sort of know it when you're in one of those conversations that it's going on. And it's not the talking past one another that I think a lot of us have experienced. I don't know, in the last few decades, at least of my life.
So, as we talk about kind of your use of Gadamer, you talk about his critique of the Enlightenment, and you talk about this turn from Hobbes to Rousseau. What is this turn that you see from Hobbes to Rousseau, and why is that important in your work?
Yeah. Okay, so this is kind of how I frame things in the beginning, which is a sort of big picture, 30,000 foot view, if you will, of what's going on with the deliberative Democrats over the last, I don't know, probably since the mid 20th century. Let's date it back to that. Largely, the Democratic theory is concerned over that period with arguing about what's good about democracy, to put it kind of bluntly. And by the mid 20th century, the consensus view seems to be a largely utilitarian one. And so it's indebted to, I think, originally speaking, Thomas Hobbes. Of course, a lot of other people, a lot of other scholars figure into that. But originally, I think it goes back to Thomas Hobbes. And the idea is that democracy is a good thing because it allows us to aggregate our preferences in a maximal kind of way. It successfully kind of aggregates everyone's interests in a way that treats them all equally, and they do so through various mechanisms in democratic societies. The franchise, of course, is the most obvious, but also interest groups do this, and the ability to express your interests freely, vis-a-vis your fellow citizens, the government, and so on. And then by the time you get into the late 20th century, being the last couple decades of the 20th century, these thinkers start to come along and they start to say, hey, wait a minute. There's something that's not really satisfying about that from the viewpoint of democracy. It's not true to the spirit of democracy, so to speak. And what they mean by that is if all we do is kind of vote our preferences, right, about whatever, and then cross our fingers that my interests outweigh yours, and then I'm a winner, you're a loser, so to speak. There's something, there's a sense in which we're not really, we're not really treating one another as in our full democratic capacity, right? We've sort of, I've almost sort of used you as a means to an end, right? And I think that Rousseau is really the thinker who kind of provides inspiration for this, because what they say is, if on the other hand, I have to justify myself to you, I have to try and persuade you of my position, then in some sense, I'm trying to get you on board as kind of a co-author or a co-legislator of the policies that I want to see enacted, right? And of course, Rousseau, famously in The Social Contract, he says, being a co-author, a co-legislator of a will that is shared with others, a general will, is what it means to be a true citizen in the fullest sense, right? And so I think ultimately that's what they're trying to advocate for, is that kind of mutual appeal in a shared rule, right? A shared polity, in which I treat you as an equal, you treat me as an equal. We try and persuade one another, and of course, a consensus isn't guaranteed when you do that. But they say that it's the process of justification that is treating one another as the equals that full citizenship requires. Now that's kind of the turn, so to speak, from Hobbes to Rousseau. And by the 1990s, you see these guys, John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, right? They're representing the Anglo-analytic tradition and the continental philosophical tradition. And they're sort of converging on similar ideas of this. So they've got sort of different philosophical orientations. But they're kind of, there's subtle, variations in what they think is required of a good deliberation. But they're kind of coming together and they're saying deliberation and more of it, and widespread deliberation is ultimately the sine qua non, the essential component of what it means to have a really robust democratic polity. And again, this is kind of where I come in and say, well, deliberation's a good thing, and that's all, well and good. But I think that the way that they're articulating this fails to appreciate some of the hard work that needs to be done beforehand, before we ever get into a public forum and do this thing called deliberation. And one of the big oversights, I think, is that I mentioned in the book is that of scale, and that of the communities that are essential prerequisites for deliberating well. They can't be the kind of macro liberal democratic hundreds of millions of people coming together, and there are no sort of prerequisites for what it means to deliberate with your fellow citizen. I think that's where they sort of they start to look a little bit idealistic in their views of deliberation. They don't see those preconditions as being as important as I do, and that's where I think Gadamer can be helpful.
The idea of rehabilitating prejudice, which is always that always gets people's hackles up. You're like, so habitus. When we talk about Pierre Bourdieu, his the logic of practice. I've been reading in Charles Taylor, who is kind of in similar veins to Gadamer.
Yeah,
and he references Pierre Bourdieu, these ideas. Kind of between individual habits and culture, you have those kind of passed down habits that kind of help us identify in a community. Is that kind of the range that we're talking about? Like, what's the size of these communities? So it's a little bit of a double question, but I think I'm trying to locate, and I think I understand, but I want to understand what scale communities are we talking about here that are kind of the preconditions?
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest. I don't give an exact delineation in the book. I don't say, well, it's 5,000 people. It's an ancient Greek polis, right?
I wasn't looking for an exact number, to be fair. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so one of the things that I say in the book, and I hope you don't think that this is a cheap way out of of answering the question, but one of the things that I say in the book is, if you want to think of small, or if you want to think of the scale on which, conversely, the deliberative Democrats are talking, don't think of it as an either or, which I think would kind of pin me down or pin someone down to giving a number or something like that. And then, beyond a state, let's say, right, beyond tens of millions of people, you no longer have small. I would rather think of it as a continuum. And so with Gadamer, what's key is the degree to which I think our practices inform our language. And as you sort of move further along that scale, you're going to see an increasing attenuation of shared meanings, right? As you move increasingly along that continuum from, the smallest of communities, which, if you're talking about a small town or something like that, in which everybody's known everybody for generations, right? And we all know what each other are talking about when we talk about what it means to whatever, be free or, or have a sense of courage or faith or whatever. And then, you could go all the way to the other end of the scale to the nation state, the modern nation state, which renders completely thin and abstract those shared meanings. And I think that's where we are to a large extent today. And so what I'm arguing for in the book, I don't say exactly what it means to return to small scale. But actually, one thing I do say is I'm not talking about kind of restoring the Greek polis or, anti-federalist America or anything like that, but sort of pushing the needle back, so to speak, in the other direction. And so I'm not advocating for some sort of counter utopia to what I think is kind of the utopian individualistic view of modern, liberal democratic theory. But I do think that there's kind of the sense out there that as we become radically more autonomous as individuals, radically more free, that nothing is lost, if that makes sense. And so and I wouldn't even deny necessarily that, the gains in freedom that we've made are good things. I think they can be wonderful things. But the problem is that there's no recognition that there is a cost in terms of shared meanings. There's a cost in terms of disciplines or a kind of habits of self-restraint and the exercise of civility and the ability to rein in our egoistic selves so that process of listening can take place. And so no number, but it's kind of an effort to say that we're on a continuum here, and we should be more cognizant of those choices. If you get into the literature on deliberative democracy, what a lot of these folks will tell you is that we are completely. I apologize for the banging in the background. That's the construction I was mentioning before. But what a lot of the deliberative Democrats will tell you is that we are completely beyond community. In other words, the modern world is one in which community in the old sense does not happen anymore because we have sort of awoken into enlightenment. Jürgen Habermas says this in particular. He talks about, he has this sort of historical understanding of modernity. When modern society begins, we can no longer sort of view our inherited values the same way. We're in a kind of post-metaphysical society. And I find that to be an attempt to kind of preempt the negotiation of those two values I was pointing to a minute ago, right? The autonomous individual and the thick embedded communities in which shared meanings are helpful to true understanding and truly persuading and reasoning and deliberating with one another. And so, if we kind of just embrace this atomized view of society, and we say that, well, this is modernity. There's no going back. We can do nothing but be autonomous individuals, not really part of any thick or shared sense of virtue. Um, Ironically, I think that takes away one of the freedoms that I think is key to being, well, just to being a human being, right? I mean, deciding whether we want to be in community with one another, um, is, I think, an important part of of what that the formation of that collective consciousness should look like. And so, yeah, freedom, autonomy, they can be very good things. Attenuating the thick bonds of a shared community, that can be good at times. But I think that, in terms of deliberation, something gets lost the more you venture in that direction as a society, and the less that you prioritize, um, small scale community. And if you want to put sort of, heuristics in there, you could think of the small town. You could think of, the region. These kinds of levels of aggregation, I think, would be certainly more conducive than, the nation state or even the state in the U.S.
As you're talking here about the continuum, uh,
Yeah,
some of these preconditions that you're mentioning, shared meaning, civility, you can see how it's not just a matter of the size of the community, but it's the community over time that matters too. So, for instance, lived in Orlando for a couple of years, now live outside Orlando. And Orlando is a very fluid place. I was part of a small men's group, and I think there were 8 guys, and 2 of them had lived there. One had lived there since he was 5, and another had lived there since he was 5. The rest of us had been there in the last 5 years. And so there, even though we were tight knit and it was small scale, shared meaning was not the same as what you're talking about, like generations in the same town.
that's right. That's right. And even in situations like that, and I think Gadamer would be sympathetic, to what I'm about to say. Even in situations like that, shared meaning isn't lost entirely, right? I mean, he says this, right? He says there's never the impossibility of going on, of having a kind of, translation between horizons of understanding. But it takes a heck of a lot more work
Yes.
when you're with people who don't share those roots. It is like translating between languages. I mean, I think that metaphor that he uses is a really apt one for understanding, and how that shared meaning, um, how it develops and unfolds between people. Yeah, and I'm not saying that we should never try to understand anyone outside of our own community. And I think that's vital at times, and that's important for any sort of, governance, right? But I think there's, a sense in which, you know, these. I think there's a sense in which deliberation doesn't owe anything to that earlier acculturative process, and that we can kind of benefit from the fruits of those communities without ever having to cultivate them in the first place.
I remember Britain and America, and I think this was post World War II. I can't remember exactly, but some diplomatic talks kept going off the rails and had nothing to do with the actual negotiations. It was because they were speaking the same language, and saying the same words, but meaning different things. There were several examples.
Yeah,
They were just losing their tempers with each other. The one example I remember is the Americans would say, "Let's table that," and that meant to take it off the table and talk about it later. And the
right.
British, it meant to put it up on the agenda. And so, like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I think that's when we talk about continuum. The point, uh, obviously, with 8 guys, you're going to be able to figure out shared meaning, but it's going to take more work. And a big part of what Gadamer takes from someone like Heidegger is that we are mortal, and that we can only spend so much time trying to understand each other. And so we save, like I think you mentioned earlier, you're talking about we can take a lot of value from our pre-existing communities because we have the already shared knowledge. And of course we can go beyond our community, but that takes work. And so we can skip a lot of work, which we have to, because you can't reconstruct everything from the ground up every time.
That's right.
In two ways. One is with shared meaning. The other one is with civility. And I think of that like we have meaning that is something that so for instance, you can have a bigger community that's been more stable for a long time. That's going to have shared meaning in a way that a smaller community that has been for a shorter time will have maybe similar. So it's across time and across scale, but it's not just meaning, it's also manners. And I want to touch on this because you've talked about civility and how important that is in deliberation and how we don't have that. And what you've been talking about sparked in me this idea that when you can't agree on manners, because that's something that happens along in a community. So for instance, coming from New England, living in the South, we interrupt each other in my family. That's what we do. And it's because you're so excited about what the other person's saying. And it's incredibly rude down here. It's something I have to curb all the time. My grandfather actually asked my mom one time if my dad was hard of hearing because he kept interrupting. And they were both being polite, right?
Yeah, right.
But what happens
thought they were.
Yes, you're right. They're both, yes. Well, and that's where, so who's the judge, right? That's something that gets worked out over time or among, a certain amount of people.
That's right.
But what I'm seeing in our culture, and I think this is kind of even what you were saying, and I just want to make sure we're on the same track. Maybe shared meaning here. Is that when you don't have shared manners, generally what happens is the most assertive person wins. And that's definitely what the internet feels like to me right now. It's like, like the person. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead and finish your thought, please.
I think I was kind of petering off. That was the main thrust.
No. I think you're spot on. I think you're spot on. And what that calls to mind is the discussions. There's a student of Gadamer's, P. Christopher Smith, who has written a fantastic book on his thinking in which he talks a lot about deliberation. In fact, I drew heavily on his work for the book. But he focuses in particular on Gadamer's discussion of the Platonic dialogues and the ways in which these people have not been civilized in the necessary manner. The sophists have not been civilized in the necessary manner for deliberation. If you look at those figures, if you look at them as not just voices that are saying things, right? Voices that are articulating ideas, but actual characters, actual people with histories, and tempers, right? Thrasymachus in the Republic famously, right, can't sit still. He, leaps at them like a wild beast, and he interrupts the dialogue, and he says, "Socrates, there you go again," right? And he can't hold back. He's not civilized. And Callicles in the Gorgias, right? These kinds of people haven't been habituated into a community. And what Smith says about this is, look, it's not a coincidence that these people are itinerants, that these people are kind of free-floating and they have no community. They're not really part of Athens. They come in and they're not really invested in the dialogue or understanding what justice is. And so what does their behavior look like? It's self-assertive. It's exactly what you just described. And it's exactly the situation that we find ourselves in today, especially with social media, right? We are a bunch of free-floating, social atoms. And what is it that we, with these people who aren't even part of our community, what is it that we all ultimately resort to so much of the time is just self-assertion. We don't know how to have our egoistic selves reined in or disciplined in the necessary manner in which you find it in a properly ordered community, that I think Socrates was trying to really model that in the Platonic dialogues. He's trying to model what good deliberation looks like. And yeah, so I agree with your point completely that this is kind of what we're left with, and this is kind of what sparked my interest in the book, is that we're no longer not only are we no longer benefiting from that, or less and less from that, but my problem with deliberative democracy as a theory is they no longer even value it. They no longer even value the process of civilizing someone in a community as a necessary prerequisite for good or sound deliberation. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to correct in the book, is seeing this at least as normatively important, right? There's only so much I can change with one book, but right. But at least maybe trying to get our understanding of this as a normative priority straight is worth doing and worth talking about. And so that's kind of what I'm up to. So I think, but what you were just reminded of, I mean, for me, you're preaching to the converted. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, as you're talking about this question earlier about the denial of community, and it's been a hot minute since I've looked. I didn't read too deep into it, but I remember reading a little bit about Habermas critiquing Gadamer, and I could see traces of that going on here, because I think that the general thing I came with was that Habermas thought Gadamer was naive, right? And so.
Yeah, they both think the other is naive.
Yes,
that's a two-way street, but yes.
Yeah. As we talk about, and this might go to where Gadamer struggles with Habermas, you talk about the denial of community and how that affects the question of what it means to be human. Am I right in, as I listen to that, understanding that it really affects humanity in two different ways, or our view of humanity? One is the question of what is our purpose? Is part of our purpose to become part of a community? Like, is that a good? And the other one is a slightly different question, but also really important, and I think would strike right at the heart of this discussion of deliberative democracy. And that's, are human beings capable of functioning outside of that kind of community?
Yeah. Wow. Great questions. So the first, and I think the first is much easier than the second. It's not easy, but the second's really hard.
Yeah, take your time. Yeah, I know. Like, obviously, that was just like a simple question, right? Like, no, like, sorry.
Yeah. They're wonderful questions. So, I mean, but the first, I think, I'm going to answer for myself. I always hate answering for Gadamer. I don't know fair. Necessarily. Yes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I say this in the book, that I'm only using his thinking. I'm appropriating his insights for my own sort of thinking through these problems, and I don't want to ever speak for him.
Well, that's all you can do, right? Like, I mean, that's a very Gadamer position.
Right. That's right. And I think so that distance, that daylight between my views and his, is kind of essential there. But I do think that there are trade-offs, is the way to think of it. And this kind of goes back to what we were saying before, that is community. I think you said, is there something essential about living in community, is the way you put it. And I think that there are certain aspects of human flourishing, is the way I would put it, that one would be hard pressed to find anywhere beyond a community. And I think shared meaning, and this is what my book is about, and shared meaning is one of them, is one of the big ones. And so, does that mean that we all, need to get back to some smaller scale way of living? not an absolute sense, but there is a sense in which those goods or those elements of human flourishing that depend on community will be increasingly attenuated as we get further and further away from that. And the second part of your question was, could we ever live beyond it, or something to that effect?
So there was the purpose question and the good, right? And the other question was the capacity. And so for instance, as we're talking about like kind of this formation of the self, this idea that, you have this itinerant wild beast kind of person who shows up in the Platonic dialogues, and I think we're all familiar with online.
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
And this question of education and manners, that if we aren't part of these kind of communities, do we even have the capacity to function in deliberation? And so like those are two, both of those are like, what does it mean to be human? And one of them is like, I don't think we can function as this democratic human without these kind of formation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think you're kind of pressing me in that kind of pessimistic implication of what I'm saying. But I mean, it's hard to resist. Uh, how long can we go on like this? I mean, to put it kind of, state it flatly like that, right? I mean, how much longer can we go on like this without those resources of civility? And I think the last 5-10 years have shown things getting worse, increasingly worse. I don't see um, a whole lot of signs or reasons for things to get better on the horizon. And what would have to happen is, I think, a conscious, and very intentional um, attempt to resurrect these resources. Kind of recognize, it's kind of like the decision that people make. I talk to my students about this all the time. The decision that people make to get off of social media. It's a very kind of trite, small scale example, but it's kind of like there are things that we can do that are within our power, not to just sort of go with the flow of modernity and the way in which things have been getting worse and worse. If to follow up on what you were saying, the wild beast of the social atom out there on the internet is what's sort of this culmination of everything that's wrong with our social relationships today. We don't have to be a part of that, right? I mean, we can be more present. We can live with the people around us instead of constantly tuning in on our phones all the time and feeling the need to be seen out there by these anonymous others. So that's just one small scale, but there are other very, I think, self-conscious ways of cultivating, local community. It doesn't all have to do with the internet. That's certainly a good target for such reforms, but I think one of the ways in which I think local communities are increasingly bolstered is the homeschool movement has been fantastic in this way. And I think that there's a kind of anonymity of, the large public school system in which, everyone is just sort of there to learn the basics of going out and one day getting an education, getting a job, and earning more money. These movements are more often more focused on educating for virtue, educating for character, educating the whole person. Um, and that kind of, I don't think that's a coincidence that doesn't exist on a large scale. And so, there are lots of little things that people do to restore their communities, and to cultivate the relationships that they're a part of. Um, but but I think it's not an easy solution. It's not electing the right candidate who's going to save America. It's not a policy that's going to make everything better, and it's not something that maybe we're even going to see in our lifetime. But I think it is the long, hard work of building a civilization. I think that's that's the realistic answer, and it doesn't. It might not be all that inspiring to people who want the sort of the answer right here and now. I talk to my students about this kind of thing all the time, and they want the fix, they want the quick fix, but I don't think that exists.
One, I would, when I asked it, I didn't think of it as pessimistic. In fact, in a lot of ways, what you're talking about with the your critique of the deliberative turn is that it's a problem not to have this be a normative ideal, right? And so if we can make civility a normative ideal again, like this, like these preconditions, normative ideals that lead into deliberation. Excuse me. Was that, yeah, let me say that correctly. All right. I just realized
right.
that.
Yeah.
I just, yeah. I skipped right over the critique there. Got a little ahead of myself. So this idea, and I think of a couple different things. I had Mark Roach on, Dr. Mark Roach on from Notre Dame to talk about why liberal education and why liberal arts education.
Gotcha.
And he talked about all too often, and the reason I thought this is the example you gave, people go to college, and he has seen this swing in the midst of his academic career. It used to be the number one thing was essentially to become a better human. And now it's to make more money after college.
Yes.
And he said the problem with that is that making money is, we have created an end that's just another means to an end without giving people, and I've seen this with so many business owners, they make a lot of money and then they don't know what to do with themselves. It's a very common thing.
Yeah.
I mean, other than, well, there some fall apart, and then some of them just kind of languish and kind of like, well, I guess I retire early, and then I just play. I go on cruises, and it's like, is this really what we're made for?
Yeah.
The other one, and I think we talk about this individual formation, and I just saw this in a podcast where a man was talking about end of life care. And I thought about it from like the homeschooling side of things. I have 5 kids of my own. I homeschool. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, so I was like, oh, there you
Speaking
go.
of
I know.
preaching to the converted,
Right,
yeah.
I know, yeah. And a lot of it has to do with this kind of character-based thing. And I'm still working through this. I don't know how I feel about this. But it struck me because you talked about they're making money to go out and they take care of themselves. That's kind of the goal with this kind of college, this educational approach. And his response was, everybody's concern with end of life care is that they don't want to be a burden to their family. And he said, I think that's wrong. I think we should be a burden to our family because it gives them a chance to be part, like that's what it means to be family. And
that's interesting.
yeah, and I think he's framing that polemically. Like, I don't think it's like I'm going to sabotage my bank account, right? But the idea that by saying I don't want to be a burden, what we're really doing is we're severing the obligations between family, and it's part of that autonomous move, that move towards autonomy that is kind of ripping these things apart. I feel like that's what I had to say. I don't think it's really a question, and I probably am doing a bad job as a host. So I just like
not at all.
I'm connecting. Yeah, I'm just trying to.
That's a really interesting insight. I mean, it's part of this larger framework of what it means to be a human, and what it means to what it means to be a part of a society. I'm kind of thinking of the way you originally put your question. To be beyond community, Aristotle says, is either to be a beast or a god. Right. This is a famous line from Aristotle, and so I think, in some sense, we're not quite there. But when we talk about, again, the Thrasymacheian wild beast of kind of social media today, aren't we kind of starting to go down that road? Aren't we kind of starting to see what a human being, severed of all ties, severed of all discipline, completely uncivilized, would look like? It's kind of striking that we thought all that would be necessary, and all that would be good about the internet would be communication. And there was never a kind of concern for what would be communicated. There was never a concern for the relationships that would be, they have to either be built, cultivated, or destroyed, or I suppose ignored. But there's never really an understanding of what the effects of this new set of technologies would be on the human beings that are interacting on them. It's just that the flow of information is always good, and that it's faster, and that there's more access to everything. And so it must be an unqualified good. But I think that, this is kind of the forgetfulness of being is the way Heidegger would put it, right? And Gadamer gets this from Heidegger. But it's this idea that we completely forget that there are human beings on the other side of this screen. There's just a free flow of information, and it goes from one screen to the other. But there's never really a concern for what happens to the person who's reading and interpreting it, and how the words change them, and how they might respond in turn to those words. So I think what you said makes a lot of sense.
As we're kind of, I want to be respectful of your time. As we talk about kind of this formation, I feel like there's this trap that we can fall into. And I love that line from Aristotle. You said we either are going to be beyond communities, to be a beast or a god. As we talk about this incredible influx of information, I felt this enlightenment trap early on. I grew up in a very kind of like modernist background. And I was told I needed to be all these things to be a good citizen. And the list of things that you need to understand in order to like exist as this autonomous individual is kind of insane, right? When you look at the Cartesian project and you're like, hey, you need to build everything up from absolutely certain principles for everything. It's like that's it is a godlike project. And so most people give up and they end up being beasts. That's I don't know. That was an interesting. Does that track with kind of what you're saying there? Is that a fair thing to pull out?
Yeah. It's interesting. One of the things I say in the last chapter, the Enlightenment project has kind of two dimensions to it, two tendencies within it. One is atomization, right? And the other is kind of a holism, right? And I think we sort of go from one extreme to the other of wanting to be all encompassing, like the sort of the community without limits of the deliberative Democrats. The other is this kind of Hobbesian, every person, every human being for his or herself. And I think that's kind of the twin trap of modernity. And I think, but I think both, and I say this in the last chapter, both ultimately are individualistic at their core. They don't have a proper understanding of human beings' relationships to one another. And so that's why I think that these, in the biggest sense, that's why I go back to Aristotle. That's why I go back to, a person like Gadamer who draws heavily on Aristotle, is because it's kind of rediscovering the social roots of human order and proper relationship to each other. And the book does it in the context of deliberation. But, in my thinking, my research, it's not just limited to that. That's just this project. But I do think that a return to Aristotle, or the Aristotelian roots of, understanding human nature, is something that's desperately needed in this kind of modern autonomous society in which we're living, this atomized society in which we're living.
When we talked earlier, we talked about meaning, we talked about civility. Are there other preconditions that people need in order to engage in this kind of deliberative democracy? And are any of them especially linked to community?
That's a really interesting question. I don't I don't talk about it in the book. Really, I sort of focus on those two as first and foremost. And that's probably, I don't really have too much to say about that for now. I'm sorry,
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
But I'll have to think through your prodding on that a little bit more. But I don't have anything else on the top of my mind related to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's shared meaning, which is in a lot of ways education and civility are like great places to start. Like valuing,
Yeah.
like I think that's more than enough for our society to focus on. I think if we got those two and really focus on them, that'd probably be good. So I don't think you've like left off anything important. Yeah.
I guess it depends on whether you're restricting. I guess if was your question focused specifically on deliberation? Because if deliberation is kind of the focus, then I mean I think those would be kind of some key foundations that, again, I'm kind of at a loss to go too much further, um, but of course you can go far beyond that for things like educating, well, as you said before, educating the person, right, in a whole list of virtues that are useful far beyond just deliberating with others, but just living a good life. But anyway,
yeah,
that's about it.
Is it so? Maybe I should have asked, instead of a deliberative democracy, just democracy in general, because there is the kind of that constraint, and that's part of what you're critiquing, is that constraint. Is that fair?
So, I mean, that whole catalog of virtues.
Yeah.
I mean, what that's really speaking to is the kind of restrained personality or a knowledge of limits that I think we've lost sight of. I mean, I'm sort of going beyond the book here, but I think we've lost sight of as a society. Yeah, whether democratic or any other form, I think is essential for any good society, is an understanding of limits, but certainly to democracy. The Greeks, incidentally, were certainly wary of democracy for this reason. They thought that it had the potential to kind of do away with the limits on the appetite. That, in many respects, I think we're kind of proving them to be right. But I think that insofar as our education has become increasingly utilitarian, we have lost sight of the teaching of those virtues. And so, the democratic society that we are inheritors of, I think, was for a long, long time, at least, I don't know if cognizant of is the right word, but at least benefiting from the teaching of those kinds of virtues. I don't know to what degree that was, as self-conscious as I'm kind of making it. But I think that in many respects, democracy has kind of lost sight of other ways in which this is going to harm the polity, right? The voraciousness of the modern appetite, and the constant need for more, and more is always better, and the satisfaction of desire can't be in any way detrimental to the well-being of the polity. So, yeah, the teaching of the virtues could instill the proper self-restraint that I think any democracy is ultimately going to need in the long run, or any society is going to need in the long run. And our utilitarian system of education has certainly lost sight of that.
Thank you. It's a very gracious response. I'm digging for things beyond the book because I am that optimist. I want to know what the solutions are, right? And I know they're not easy solutions.
Yes.
No one looks at the acquiring a virtue and goes, "Oh, that's easy." At least not anyone who's tried it.
Yeah.
So you've been very patient. Thank you. Before we wrap up here, if you could leave one thing for our listeners to kind of chew on, to meditate on throughout the week, what would you leave for them kind of as a final thought?
I would say, kind of touching on some of the bigger questions that we've been talking about over the last hour or so. Um, insofar as you have those choices in your life between more freedom, more autonomy, and thicker, more meaningful relationships, what do you think is missing? Are you missing freedom? Are you missing autonomy? Are you missing self-determination? Or are you missing the deep connection with other human beings that comes out of thicker community? That would be something that I think most people would profit from, myself included. I'm not, I don't want you to think I'm up on a soapbox or preaching too much. But that was kind of one of the big, I think, upshots of our conversation. And that's something that I sort of reflect on in the last chapter of the book, is that continuum between self-determination and thick communities, and how we kind of negotiate the balance in between them. What would you want to choose? What would you want to increase, if your place in the world were being reflected on for just a moment?
Credible answer. Dr. Holston, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real joy.
Thanks, PJ. Thanks for a great discussion. I appreciate it.